Good evening and welcome. My name is Christy Ballier, and I'm an assistant professor of architecture and the chair of this semester's Knowlton School Baumer Lecture Series entitled Mingle. To mingle is to shift states. It implies the ability to equally join and disconnect. It is a deliberate drift, an active movement that prioritizes overlap over blending, bleeding, and blurring. In the realm of design and planning, a mingler maintains distinct qualities while seeking productive alternatives. The lecture series, now our third of the semester, includes lecturers that are nimble as they seek innovative ways to forward their respective fields. To mingle requires skill. It is neither abrupt nor loose, and it is a magical transition that amplifies an experience. Our lecturer tonight, Tom Wiscombe, exemplifies this fascination with transition. He challenges the smooth and the blurry and believes in the magic of illusion and the discovery of the unknown. In his lecture tonight, entitled Near Figuration and Strange Containers, he will offer a possible resolution of the discourse of form versus shape that has been prevalent over the last 10 years. Tom's current work and research as founder and principal of Tom Wiscombe Architecture confronts these relationships and the relationship between boundaries, edges, and deep interior spatial figuration. As such, extents are defined, material limits are tested, and surfaces transcend their defined roles. The projects sport tattoos, evoke mystery, all while having a high level of articulation. In other words, a building you would love to sit next to on a long plane ride. All of this leads to work that is kind of hard to pin down, but it is not without definition. In fact, the work acknowledges that one of the fundamental things architecture does is to characterize the threshold between exterior and interior. And on this, he takes a position. And he is no stranger to taking a bold position. Tom, a registered architect, worked for over a decade on the right-hand side of Wolf Prick's in Coop Himmelblau's Vienna office. Unfortunately, we just missed crossing paths on our stints in Vienna. However, I may share that his impact was discussed, palpable, and very missed when he left. Of note, he was chief designer of the UFA Cinema Center in Dresden, the BMW World in Munich, and the Lyon Museum of Confluence, three very exceptional works of contemporary architecture. And so now he is uniquely positioned to develop a language that is both rooted in the discipline of architecture while affording him the ability to stand on the shoulders of it. This combination of broad perspective and honed skill has resulted in an innovative trajectory, one that aims to transition a generation beyond the extremes of sharp slices, abrupt shifts, and ubiquitous smoothness. The project acknowledges the seam, the crease, and the graphic, and the nuanced negotiations between them. Tonight, I suspect Tom will share these negotiations with us. In addition to his international practice, Tom is a senior faculty member at SciArc, where he teaches design in the MArch2 program and the ESTM programs, and is the Applied Studies Coordinator. He also teaches Advanced Research Studio as a visiting professor at Penn Design in Philadelphia. It is a very good time for you, and also for us. In addition to tonight's lecture, Tom has generously agreed to lead a workshop that kicked off this morning with 25 graduate and undergraduate students. The final results will be reviewed in the jury space on Saturday evening at 6 p.m. Please plan on joining us. And in closing, be prepared to fall into the world of the unexpected. Please help me welcome Tom Wiscombe.
Testing. Good. That was really great. Thank you so much, Christy. Really thoughtful. I appreciate that. And thanks also for having me to Rob. I appreciate that very much, having me out. And thanks to the students in advance for your hard work over the next 4 days. I'm really looking forward to what goes down. So let's get started. I wanted to throw out 5 points of architecture. I tried to do 4, so I wouldn't do 5, and then I tried to do 6, and then I kept ending up with 5. Sorry about that. It happens to architects. So this is a kind of an overview. Some of these are relatively general ideas about architecture, and I'm finding more and more in my work that I need a kind of almost an ethical approach to the work that goes beyond specific stylistic languages and things that I've been developing in the work. I need that as well to do projects, but I also need I need something that stabilizes or a foundation for the work. So these are my 5 points. Objects over flows, mystery over scientism, architecture constructs its own world and cannot be drawn forth from information or context. The container-contained spatial relation is fundamental to architecture, and tectonics is not about the technical, but about creating fictions. So, objects over flows. This is a contemporary discourse, which I think many of you are probably familiar with, where the first and even second generation of especially digital architecture, which is now a more or less meaningless term, digital architecture now, had a lot to do with identifying continuities between things, hybridizing things, deforming things. And there was some extremely interesting and good work done in this period in the 90s and the early 2000s. This is the time when I went to school, when I became familiar with the work of Gilles Deleuze, and I think that this was a very, very important time for architecture because it was that moment where there was release from the divisions and the speculation of deconstructivism and postmodernism in the late 80s, and it really it was a very projective time for architecture, and basically I think that period resulted in work that was very much interested in looking at what things drive other things, and I would say that's captured well in the term intensive forces. We've heard this a lot in the 90s and the early 2000s. The idea that there are things, that there are forces that underlie the visible world, the intense world as opposed to the extensive world, which is coming from Gilles Deleuze. This image is a very memorable one for me because it came out when I was an undergrad, and well, it's not from Sanford Quinter. Sanford Quinter put it in his essay called Landscapes of Change, but it's actually from Conrad Waddington, and it's a diagram showing how DNA is expressed in specific objects. And what's important about the diagram are these sort of guy wires. And this is the epigenetic landscape that was so important at that time, where things are transforming or mutating slowly or even pathologically based on these forces that are acting on it. And I would say that there's another major shift, almost exactly 20 years now in advance, or fast forwarded from that. If that was captured in 1993 and maybe folding in architecture in that major movement while I was an undergrad, I would say that there's a new movement now which really looks to move beyond the idea that the world is basically one giant communication network, move beyond the idea that everything's an ecology, that everything can become something else, for instance in the analogy of the werewolf from Gilles Deleuze, and that things do have boundaries and edges, that they are precise, and that there is autonomy between things in the world, and that things are unique. Everything from the microphone on the table, to my laptop, to my glasses, to this room full of people, to the galaxy that we're in. That we can imagine and understand those things in the world better as independent units, rather than as flux and flow. Okay, so this is, I think, right now, at least it's a big transition in discourse, in philosophy certainly, and in architecture it has been for the last couple of years. So, just to refer you to one of my favorite animals, the orca, this thing does not need its context. It doesn't need the flotsam, it doesn't need the ocean, it doesn't need any of those things in order to be understood and appreciated. It's quite strange also, I have to say, this high contrast animal, which could be a toy, but we know it's extremely dangerous. So in a way, it has a lot of mystery embedded in it, a lot of depth to it that doesn't require the context to understand it. We can certainly, if we were biologists, we could take apart the orca and we could break it down into its constituent parts. We could say, well, it's made of atoms, and the atoms are made of protons and electrons. Or we could say, well, it's just part, on the low end and on the upper end, we could break the orca down into just being part of a larger ecology. It's one animal amongst many, and the ecology is what's important. So in either way, we're reducing the orca as an object, as an autonomous being, down to something less than what it is. So one of the weird things about imagining that objects have a certain autonomy is it puts a wrench into our traditional understanding of part-to-whole relations, in the sense that usually when we say part-to-whole, and we do say that a lot in architecture, we mean unity or gestalt, or the way that things come together into a whole. So we're privileging the whole. And when you start to imagine a lot of different objects in the world on a flat plane, a flat ontological plane, then one of the things that comes out of that is that you have this, too many devices here. I can't point with this, can I? Oh, yeah. You suddenly have autonomous objects like we do in our bodies. Cells are certainly autonomous to some degree, but they all come together to create what we understand as a body. So what we have are individual objects making up the constituent parts of larger objects, rather than parts which make up a whole. It changes a lot if you think about it. So a lot of the work that I've been doing the last few years has been in trying to figure out ways through this dilemma of either a world of totally autonomous things versus a world totally made up of flows, networks, and communication. And I'm finding that there's a way through, there's another way through, there's another path. And the bird knows this. These two birds are not merging into the other bird. They're sort of nestling into one another. They have difference in autonomy. But there's also something that does definitely draw them together into something else, into something new, a new object. Or here, where there are two entities that retain their difference. This is Ren and Stimpy that most people in here probably don't know, but that's from my era. Where they're always squishing each other, or like something's always being slightly transformed, but nothing's ever destroyed or damaged. And I think that's really interesting that they maintain their silhouette, really, and their autonomy, but that they can have some kind of effect on one another without ever damaging or transforming or otherwise erasing the other identity. So this is what Christy was just mentioning, this idea of near figuration. I think has been definitely a driver in the work, which, as I explained to my students earlier today, has to do with not trying to necessarily, I may have said it earlier today like this, but not necessarily trying to resolve the polarity between the discourse of shape and form, which I would say, and I did tell my students today, certainly has to do with the work of Bob Somel, privileging shape, and Greg Lynn, privileging form, both of whom were my instructors at grad school. So it's been very interesting thinking about those two thoughts and trying to find a resolution in the middle. And for me, that's near figuration. So definition: what do I mean by shape? Something that has very strict contour, boundary, and something that's graphic and has silhouette. Versus form, which is something that can transition, transform, something that can evidence slight changes or differences in degree versus total differences in kind, which I would associate with shape. So shapes. I keep thinking about Space Invaders lately because part of this movement back towards shape and sort of, let's say, peeling away from form for me has been a sense of wanting to move towards something that's lower resolution, and I'm starting to call it almost ancient geometry, if that makes any sense. I've been talking about ziggurats, crystals, jacks, really base kinds of forms, and it's directly in response to for so long having dealt with high fidelity forms, and I think there's been a lot of discourse about high fidelity forms in terms of excess, intricacy, elegance. There are all kinds of words that are relating to the discourse of sort of extreme high fidelity, and I think at this point, after 20 years, we've exhausted a lot of that, in my opinion. So I'm really interested in the chunkiness of Space Invaders, and I keep thinking, when it came out in the 80s, when I was a kid, like this was the first and only video game was Space Invaders, and so I don't know, there's something about the figuration of these guys that I like very much. So the way that we've been using these chunky figures in the office is by making things that are extremely low poly, I call them down-res objects, which have some crystalline traits, some ziggurat-like traits, which I mean stepping or even kind of voxeling qualities. But basically very, very hard shapes with strong silhouette. And then beginning to combine them with surface and containers where they can be pushed into, squished into, they can push out of, push into, they can have a kind of, they can be registered in form, but never in full, in the sense that you never fully understand the entirety of the silhouette of the object. You get a sense of it, but you're not given full access to it. And it's exactly that moment of the near figuration that I like very much, that it's not resolved and it remains not fully accessible. So this is a pavilion that I did for MoCA I think 2 years ago now, and we took 4 jacks. This thing it was 20 feet high, 10 by 10 in plan, and 20 feet high. We made it out of Kevlar, so it could be very, very thin and make a transformation from very thin surface into mass. And that was basically the trick of the thing, was that from the outside, or from the inside, it registered as heavy mass hanging over your head when you inhabited this pavilion. But then from the outside, it registered as holes. So we used, in this case, figures in order to press into surfaces, but then we threw them away and just left the resultant near figuration on the interior. So this is the piece. And it reminded me, when I was putting this in the lecture, it reminded me of a piece that I did a long time ago. 2003, actually, while I was working for Wolf, I did this on the side. And this was PS1 in New York, if you know that project. It's now in its 20th year or something, I'm not sure. In fact, I heard they just decided this next year that I had another one. So I did this project, and what was important, I guess I realized that there was some consistency there in having these large, dumb figures inside of a second skin or a container. And this was my project for that. We had 50-foot-long diamonds that were structural diamonds. And these things were put in such an adjacency that they could span a long distance. But it had an extreme day-night reading, where in the nighttime you would read the separate diamond-like objects, and then during the day it would read more like a solid mass. So, mystery over scientism. Why would I be talking about that? I would be talking about that because in architecture, and this is something that I've talked a lot with Jeff Kipnis about, and we agree on, that architecture to a great degree has begun to associate itself more and more with the idea that architecture is a form of knowledge, and the goal of architecture is to either solve problems or to gain knowledge, or to deal with the technical. And in fact, Jeff is using a studio right now on the technical as a kind of a spoof on the technical right now outside. But I guess what I want to say is that the true durability of architecture, in my opinion, is in the inability of us as its audience to fully understand it and to be able to fully get our heads around it. That's durable architecture. That's masterpiece architecture. So I really think it's very important also that we understand that architecture is not anything other than architecture, and that we respect and understand the successes and discoveries that architecture has within its own field, without having to look to landscape, or without having to look to structural engineering, without having to look to project delivery methods, and all of the other things that seep into architecture, which we certainly need to talk about, but that those are not fundamental to the things that architecture can provide. So it's funny, in science, ironically, in science, the same thing I think is true. I think the greatest moments in science are those that actually create more strangeness in the universe, not less. And I was talking about this today with my students as well. This is such a moment. Interstellar, I don't know if you've seen this movie from Chris Nolan, a very recent movie. It's basically about black holes. And very interesting that he insists on realism. And one thing that he did was attempt to recreate a real black hole, not based on a diagram of a black hole or a cartoon of a black hole, or even any kind of paraphrase of a black hole, but he wanted to make a real black hole. So he brought in scientists and the best render companies and all of these Hollywood people, and this is what they came up with. And it turns out that, I mean, this is the first time this has been seen by man. In fact, a black hole doesn't look like a hole at all, like a funnel. It looks like a sphere, and it looks like a sphere with multiple halos around it. And we didn't know this before. And I think this is really interesting. First of all, because of just the object that was discovered, but more interestingly, that it was discovered by the entertainment industry for science. So, anyway. So, what is mystery in architecture? I was giving a lecture in Spain last fall, and I went to this building from FISAC. Upon approach, you think that you're about to deal with a structural rationalist building with these beautiful, hollow structural pieces. And then you come into the interior of the thing and it's something entirely different. I was really impressed by it. I couldn't fully understand the project. Even after I got the plan afterwards, that's the best one I could find, but after I got the plan, I still didn't fully understand it. I couldn't connect the plan logic with having actually been in the space. One of the strange moments here are these holes, like black holes almost, these depressions in the back, which give you a sense that the building goes on to infinity, when in fact it's bounded by this very strange concrete wall that seems at odds with the rest of the building. I also couldn't later on remember having seen many of these entryways into this object that seemed impenetrable. I wanted to point out another one, which I noticed today a model of in the dean's office from Le Corbusier and José, which everyone knows, of course, here, but it's one that had a huge effect on me when I went to see it. Its vastness, its darkness and lightness at the same time. It's the way that its irresolution in terms of the way it hits the ground. And then the layer of these other quite strange elements that break up the mass. It's impossible to trace the origins entirely of this project. And this is mystery in architecture for me. So, all right. So architecture constructs its own worlds and cannot be drawn forth from context or information. I kind of mentioned this already in some sense, so I won't fully go through this. I'll just skip through. But one thing that's meant for me is thinking a lot about the ground. And I think that this is something that I'm definitely trying to avoid in the work, which is anytime architecture gives way to landscape, and we have the landscape building, which I would classify as a kind of lump or a hill. Now again, there was a time in the 90s when that was very advanced, and there was a lot of good work done on that subject. And I just think at this point, it's not making much sense. I'm much more interested in gaps, in ways that the architectural object can defer its landing on the ground. So these are sort of different ways we've done different projects, which of course are not entirely, invented by our office. They're just ideas borrowed, of course, from history. One of my favorites is the do. You not only do a sphere in order to identify an edge and difference from the landscape, but then you put the sphere in a hole, which I always found totally weird, and so we use that as a precedent from one of our projects. I also love these chronoplans from Russia in 1989. Apparently the most efficient plane ever invented in terms of fuel use across the ocean. It flies 1 meter above the ocean, without quite touching the water. So it doesn't fly up there, it flies down here. And the only reason we're not all flying in these is because of the falling apart of the USSR at that time. So, I'll do this another time. So the container-contained spatial relation is fundamental to architecture. These are extremely diverse, and I almost don't want to gloss over it, but they keep coming back for me. Egyptian temples, Greek temples, a kind of medieval manor, Borromini, Santa Ana. When you look at these plans, it's so important, the nesting of spaces inside of spaces, the way that interiority is deferred so that you may find yourself in an interior space that is in fact outside of the next space. So nesting or nestling things, Russian dolls, Bart Hess, one of my favorite artists, putting human figures in these strange polymer sacks, creating interstitial space between an elastic outer shell and an inner figure, deferring access and creating zones which you can't fully understand or even access. So here's an early one of our sacks. This kind of strange thing that happens when you put strong figures inside of rubberized sacks, and also the secondary effects here, reflections and things that are happening. That was such an important move for us. So starting to put some of these things inside of things, starting to even add liners to those, meaning multiple layered skins so that we can have crochet, and ending up with a lot of diagrams like this of late where we have multiple kinds of interiority, where you have the world, you have maybe an interior vast space, then you have the space inside of the figures themselves, and then you also maybe have a crochet between those. Anything related, anything to do with circulation or things like that are all tucked into the crochet, so that you don't interfere in any way with the pure spatiality of the organization of the figures and the enclosures. So this is an early one of those. This is the Collider event center. It's a mountain climbing brand center in Bulgaria. So this is one of those projects where we began with a multi-layer shell that gets peeled back. There's crochet between these layers. There are actually 3 layers to contain all of the circulation. And of course, you're reading these giant crystals that are beginning to push out in different directions and then get back resolved into a more relaxed area of the form. Tectonics. You hear this word around a lot. Sometimes it's associated with practice and sometimes with a discipline. I always associate it with a discipline, and I think if we were to draw a Venn diagram, it would always be kind of in the middle, but I think it has to be disciplinary. This building that we're in right now, I was staring at it this morning and thinking about what happens when you use marble as shingles, and what happens when you hold each shingle up by a tiny little metal bracket, the kind of estranging effect that has for architecture, very powerful estranging effect, and I found that really exciting, and that's a tectonic effect that architecture can have. So I think it's a lot about fiction. So I've been using these words recently. Christy mentioned some of them: tattoos, meta seams, supercomponents. These are all associated for me with, in particular, with the new materials that are becoming available, especially composite materials now, which allow us to rethink what tectonics even is. Until now, a lot of what we call tectonics had to do with things that we got for free, in the sense that if you use metal panel, if you use even cast-in-place concrete, if you use bricks, you always end up with some kind of trace of the method of construction or the lack of the material. In the case of cast-in-place concrete, you always get a lot of rustication from the casting process. In the case of metal panel and bricks, it's based on the human-sized unit that, for instance, a couple of people can carry, or the width of a roll of stainless steel or aluminum that comes from the factory. You're always reinforcing those limits of materials. And with composites, you don't have those so much. We can begin to imagine new ways of articulating skins, and I think it's it's an imperative actually for architecture to deal with this in this century, because I think that one model of that is that everything is totally seamless, fluid, and continuous. And I think that exactly for that reason, we need to revisit what would be the tectonics of composite materials. So we've been thinking about that in the office. Definitely trying to avoid a generic panelization of projects, where, especially in the case where we misunderstand a computer mesh as a construction system. Of course, those two have very little to do with one another, the calculus of the computer mesh and the panelization of the construction system. But again, we're always indexing the lack of the current industrial complex in the way that it, for instance, in this case, would produce pieces of stone or maybe metal panel. So tattoos for me are that which create figuration on surfaces, which can be understood as a way of breaking up surfaces, not based on a mesh, but they can also be understood in terms of the work that they can do, in terms of influence your reading of the mass. And in some cases, a tattoo for me would be that which emphasizes certain characteristics of the mass, and in other times it would be something that goes fully against the mass in order to create a second reading. Like Rorschach here from the Wiscombe, where you read, you understand that this is a human face, but because of the tattoo on the face, you have that second reading, which is a kind of an estranging effect. So this is from a project, a competition entry that we did last year, where we started to play with this idea that the tattoo logic, which are embeds into the surface, could actually be completely at odds with the construction system. So we built a system based on actually Japanese wood joinery to begin to connect super components made out of composite material, which we built in based on that logic, and we didn't try to align at all the tattoo language with the construction language. This is another piece that we did based on trying to make a figural joint. So here we're introducing actual objects with silhouette into the side of the joint, which is usually a space of nothing, and we made it a space of something. And this thing literally connects together almost as a friction fit kind of device, where you only need to add a few pegs or a little bit of glue in order for it to hold. So in a way, it's very similar to Japanese joinery, although with advanced materials. So this is the back side of that. You see the pressing through of some of the objects in a way that it keys together. So this project, Chris, would you give me a little time? I don't want to miss this. But tell me when I have 20 minutes and 10 minutes. Thank you. So this project, this was a proposal for a multi-use center in Australia, in Adelaide, which was taking over for a big site, a hospital site. And we used, I guess the important thing in my head about this project for us was this was the first time we started to use reflections or something completely outside of the architectural object in order to begin to articulate it. So you're not seeing any kind of use of the mesh or let's say grasshopper-related things where you're pulling pattern out of the calculus or the mesh itself, but we're actually applying it from the outside from something completely abstract, which we call the light studio. So in this case, these lines, you'll notice they like a black diamond. These lines are actually being projected. Imagine this as a tiny model in a giant light studio with fluorescent light bulbs. It's all virtual, it's all on the computer, but we use straight fluorescent light bulbs to project onto this black diamond. And so we built these details into the skin in order to give it a sense of scalelessness, or at least ambiguous scale, and articulate it in a completely new way that has nothing to do with meshes. And you'll notice a few things that happen here. Strange little moments where the reflections capture the edge of the existing object, and then other times where they change width, other times where they completely do something else that we have no control of. So that was an interesting discovery and one of the earlier tattoos. So, okay. Back to the figures. This project is the Taichung City Center, which I think probably maybe people in this room have done. We started with two big figures. The program asked for a library and a museum. And so, obviously, the one on the left is the library, and the one on the right is the museum. But actually, it becomes more obvious when you see the scheme, which is this. The library pushes in from the top on a surface, and the museum pushes in from the bottom. The reason for this is to get daylight for reading for the museum, and for the library. And for the museum, it becomes a self-shading environment where you can have some openings, but it's sort of it's like an umbrella over the museum. So, so this is the project. You can see that there is a discreteness of elements here. The black figures are independent from their outer shell. The outer shell also, in this case, is not a full container. It's sort of a half container, which I liked. And you can also read some of the. We broke this thing up into these almost bastion-like seams, and then we removed some of the components, which created some nice interstitial spaces between the objects themselves. You see where it's kind of missing here, some holes. And then the surface itself, which contains these objects, also gets very thick. It gets sliced open, creating a space inside of it. So that becomes a restaurant looking out over the park, but it also connects the two objects. So I think for me the most important part here is, again, the interstitial space that happens, in this case down below between the outer skin and the object, and in this case up above, to the point where there's even a platform on top of the inner figure where you can display large pieces of art, and then this connection keeps this motion. There's us moving from one of the figures across the interstitial space and into the embedded crochet of the roof element, and then looking down at the street. And I guess the last thing about it that I thought was important was that we didn't just do infill glazing to make the enclosure. The enclosure wasn't there. It was very loose and indeterminate, which I liked a lot about the project, but we had to add enclosure. So we didn't just follow the edge of the other objects. We created a new kind of configuration for that additional layer, which actually made the enclosure of the project. We did not win this project. This is a housing project I'll show very quickly. It's one of our ziggurat projects where we use a series of bars and stacks of elements in combination with crystals and other objects to create these kind of three interconnected housing blocks for New Rochelle. This was the basic diagram where the outer skin would either chop off some of these blocks, loosely contain the blocks, or form fit to some of the blocks. So we used again this idea of a container in order to almost vacuum form over these housing blocks, but also expressing the blocks in abstraction, not just as housing or as floor plates. The ground itself between these objects, we called it figure, which was basically to take additional figures and crush them and make them the ground. Here's one of the buildings. It has a giant void space in between that connects all the different housing blocks together. It's a combination of different materials, including perforated metal with balconies behind, as well as others just very simple ribbon windows, and then other just enclosed areas. There's the interior space. This is like the shared lobby space of the building. This was the National Center for Contemporary Art in Russia competition proposal. And this is where we started to really push this idea of illusion, and we really tried to make it appear that some of the objects inside of this enclosure were pushing from the inside out, some were pushing from the outside in, and some were undecided and were sort of half in, half out. So that's what the project was about. And the tattoos here were were much more aggressive than in earlier projects. these were starting to cover a lot more surface, and one of the things that a bit of the work that the tattoos did here was to begin to confuse the degree to which these jacks were disconnected from the overall mass in terms of the black almost bleeding onto the surfaces here. In this case, where there's actually a joint, and this is a separate object that's nestled into here, versus over here, where the tattoos turn almost fully black and give you the sense that it may be an independent object, but actually it's pushing out from the inside, so you don't know if there's another figure inside. In the plan, you see, again, there's that crochet that I mentioned where you can have circulation, things like that. Some of the jacks become offices and are perforated metal, others become black box theaters, and then there's even another jack here which actually is completely removed. So you only understand it from the outside as being something pressing through, but it's completely removed and becomes normal gallery space. So here's the entry situation. This is where we went for push the object into a hole. This is our version of that. And also take a flying leap from an artificial ground designed by the architect and going into the building. So this flying leap here, a 6-inch gap here, is really, really important in order to articulate the difference between the building and its ground, and then the ground and the land below. Additionally, the delamination between the inner liner and the outer shell is really important because it creates, this is the poché space that I'm talking about, but it also creates the ability to, through the delamination, to have daylight come into the poché itself. So there's the leap and the peel. The peel is very important. It's almost a suspicion of the land. It has to peel up the corners. Thank you. And then in terms of the construction of the thing, I mean, I guess, you know, sometimes for competitions it's not that healthy to make a proposal that goes top to bottom. But I always do that. I need to understand the project from the smallest detail in terms of its construction and materials, but also from its massing in the city and a lot of different levels. And so I can't not consider an object like this in terms of how it might be constructed. And so this is also one of those projects where I really think that thinking about it in terms of chunks rather than panels, infill panels, sticks of structure and all of that really makes a lot of sense. So super components, again, coming from thinking about chunks. Beginning to find ways of locking in, imagine you're on the construction site, of locking different kinds of panels together, as maybe an X and Y, but then linking them together in a Z in a different way. Thinking about how you can begin to get some of these panels here in trucks on long strips, putting them together, these strips together on the ground, on scaffolding, so you don't have overall building scaffolding, you do it on the ground. And then you use sky cranes, which are actually used quite often for lifting large pieces of yacht or other kinds of composite. You use sky cranes to lift them into place. So you don't require huge steel cranes, you don't require scaffolding for the entire project, but you just build it on the ground where it's easier and in the factory. So that's the project. Much more recent is the Guggenheim Helsinki, which 1,700 people entered, and I don't know, I think it needs to be discussed at this point, the degree to which a competition like that is even useful. I'm not sure, but I grew up, you know, in my professional life doing competitions, so I still believe in them. Our project was very much trying to go introverted and be contextual in a way that isn't literal. So it's not trying to connect to the landscape of the park around it. It doesn't have a bunch of windows that look back at the city or at specific views. It's trying to introvert in order to create a new world for art that is literally like going into a parallel universe. So it's it's at one time familiar in the sense that it's shiny, you recognize it as something that might be an iconic building. I mean, it is an iconic building. But you recognize certain parts of it, but other things like these dark caverns and the way that it kind of stands on these crystal tips rather than engaging the ground, and the way that it sits on this strange ground object definitely signal that it's not trying to fully engage the city in a normal way, but it's engaging it in a much more mysterious way. So the main reason why I went vertical on that project is because the site is the site of a port terminal, and to me, all of that infrastructure is very, very horizontal, and you don't want to confuse the Guggenheim with an infrastructural port. So we went vertical. And then the basic diagram of the project was that we would have a hidden object inside of the outer object with the intent of having this leap again, where you have crochet space with galleries that have daylight through perforated metal or other materials. So you have daylit galleries on the perimeter in crochet. Then you have bridges running across, jumping into this inner object, where you have completely controlled daylight for curation. So you have those two different worlds. You are faced with architecture whenever you leave one gallery and go across the bridge. The floor drops out, it becomes a giant vast space, and you're in architecture, and then you go back into a gallery space again. Some of the studies here. It was important in this project we started to reify the shadows of the object itself in order to make this ground object that it sat on. There's the model that we made. Standing a little bit uncomfortably on its feet. Some studies. There's the interior. I'm not going to say it has nothing to do with Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim, because we were certainly looking at that. Although this is not a void and it's not a street, but it has other things in common, obviously, with that project. So there's the section showing the crochet and the galleries inside and the model. And this is my favorite view of it, where you understand finally how the circulation is embedded in the outer wall. You have completely normal galleries that daylit here. You have the hidden, mysterious object here, and that moment of the leap between two worlds is really critical for the project. So that was it. And I just want to show two more projects. This is a competition for Kinmen, which I have to say, when I was doing this competition, I got really interested in. It's if you don't know about Kinmen Island, it's 2 kilometers away from mainland China, but it's run by Taiwan. And right now, that's maybe not as significant as it used to be, that fact, because of the relations have improved so much between Taiwan and mainland China. But basically, Kinmen is right on the battlefront of mainland China. So this, and you can see, when you're standing on Kinmen Island when I was there, you can see mainland China. And there are billboards with political slogans on both sides so that you can read them. They're giant. And there are all of these other things. There's this kind of virtual communication going on between Kinmen Island and the mainland. And so it was a super interesting site, and they need a port terminal. They want to start a tourism industry on Kinmen Island, which is a beautiful kind of untouched island. So we proposed, and this is also, I thought this was important also because it's the third in a set of terminals. The one was from Jessica Reiser and Annika Kumamoto, the first one in Kaohsiung, and then from Neil Denari in Keelung, which are both under construction, and this would have been the third one in Taiwan. So it was an important thing for me that we got into stage 2. We got second place ultimately, though, we didn't win. But the idea was that we needed to do something horizontal to take care of the infrastructure of the project. It's very much like an airport, if you know anything about port terminals. But we wanted to have these elements that were rotating in space that would constitute a kind of a gateway and also a signal back to the mainland. So we worked on that a lot based on the view from the mainland. So this is the project. The diagram is quite simple. We took 5 gigantic jacks and rotated them in space and embedded them in the terminal with departures on the top and arrivals on the bottom, just like a regular airport or port terminal. This is the models that we brought in. This is the way the program is laid out. I guess only here of note is that the vertical parts of the jack become the administration of the project, and also the boat traffic control centers for the project, for the highest jacks. So you can kind of see back there the window cutouts out of the mass itself, which is nestled in there, and then this second skin over it, which is a perforated metal skin. There's the interior where you're starting to feel some of the jacks pushing the ceiling up. We used a pattern which can be, if you glance at it for a second, it looks like a regular metal panel pattern, but we used these Chinese maze patterns that we found on the island in order to address the problem of local culture, which was a very big issue for them, for the jury, and also for us to find a way to, a kind of sleight of hand, to do something that looks familiar again, but in fact is not. If you look at this for more than 2 seconds, you realize there's no way that's a metal panel system. And these are quite large and weird maze-like pieces of skin. So we were proposing to do that out of FRP, fiber reinforced polymer. So this is the project. There's a roof garden on the top with a loop that connects you from the park all the way through the roof and all the way back down. There it is. There's the roof. All worked out. Energy. Well, it seemed, a lot of my projects I try to also figure out if there are other, in terms of performance, building performance, I try to figure out if there can be a relationship between the form language, the organizational properties of the building, and then also performance, so that I can make an argument for it, not just on formal terms, although at the end of the day, I will always start with form, and I'm most interested in that. I would consider myself a formalist, but if form can do additional work, I think I'm very interested when it can't, although I don't require that it always does. What else here? Yeah, so here's the drawing of how it would be built. You see those panels, which are quite strange shapes. They're not normal metal panels. The seams are totally irregular, but they're laying on what is otherwise completely regular construction. There's that. I guess I'll show this, and then I'll show the last project. Do we have sound? 10? Okay. Not much sound, but whatever. Ishigami won this competition. Okay. All right. So, so this is the last thing I want to show, and it's something that I'm kind of right in the middle of. It's in the old bank district of Los Angeles at 4th and Main, if you know Los Angeles at all. And this is the Farmers and Merchants Bank at 4th and Main, kind of well-known building. The project is the brainchild of Tom Gilmore, who is a developer in Los Angeles, who is my client and my friend for a long time. And he has a lot of property right in this area. He's known as the guy who brought the downtown Renaissance. in Los Angeles. And that started for him by buying this building. And he has now, I think, these two garages, this historically preserved building, which was a bank building, and the original Farmers and Merchants Bank, is now a lot-type group of 4 buildings in downtown. And basically, the project is for a museum of Los Angeles art. The mission is still in progress, as the project is still in progress. And we are putting together a board of directors and raising money for its nonprofit right now to build it. And Tom is also supporting the museum in a big way with his own funds. So what do you do when you have existing and functioning buildings, but you want to have a museum there? We walked these properties and found all of the kind of crevices and leftover spaces and hidden basements and sub-basements, rooftops, and all of that. So that's what we decided to do, is to use all the space that's not currently being used, and also not disturb the current use as much as possible of the buildings, but weave a museum inside of these 4 buildings. So this is the diagram of it, showing where we're kind of inhabiting this whole thing. It's pretty. It's the opposite of an icon, I would say, by its inherent nature of being squished into crevices and in basements, which I find really interesting, especially considering the other kinds of museums in LA and their status as icons. So I found that really interesting. And so our approach was, instead of having a unified language that would try to tie together these kind of disparate zones of building, where we would control entirely like every wall and floor and ceiling and almost try to glue it all together through surface, for instance. That would be one way to do it. We decided to do it much more based on specific moments in the museum that are bounded and different from one another, but close enough or not close enough physically, but close enough in terms of architectural language, but also in terms of view from one to the next, that you would understand that this series of 9 objects actually constitutes the museum. So there are also other more neutral or relaxed spaces where we pulled back very much and let the historical property come through. But these are the 9 things, and I'll show you. So here's what we do. We use some of the ground floor here, and then a huge basement beneath these 2 buildings, and then a sub-basement below that, which all of these contain amazing vaults with huge vault doors, beautiful vaults, which we're going to keep in the project. The vaults themselves become galleries. The sub-basement looks like it has submarine doors on 3 different adjacent levels that seem to be protecting it from atomic war. I think that's why they were built that way. So very, very interesting historical angle to the project. But basically the project is in 2 parts. It's what I'm calling the interior world, which is down in the basement, and then the exterior world, which is mostly on the roof, and that becomes the sculpture garden for that project. So this is the model of it, and you see there's stuff on the inside nestled in there in the main gallery space. On the roof, there's a big promenade. There's a Lebbeus wood sculpture that's already been installed on the roof right there as the first piece for the roof. And then there are two buildings sitting on the promenade, the new ground of the promenade, one of which is an amphitheater on the left, and the other one is a bar cafe on the right. The one on the left can be seen from Spring Street from a distance, barely, peeking up over the top, and the other one can be seen hanging out over the edge of Main Street a little. And this is a video art wall here, which is a big crochet wall, which contains a 4th means of egress that we had to add to the project. But it's no longer a means of egress. We're actually going to be using it as a pedestrian way up to the rooftop from the park, which is down below. So this is what it looks like from Main Street at 4th and Main. We're replacing the existing facade of the parking garage with a slightly perforated and slightly opaque facade. But the important thing is that you see the back of the cafe hanging out over the street, and then a reified shadow made in FRP kind of dripping down the facade. So this is how you come to know that there's something on the roof, as a kind of hint, but without understanding in full what is exactly going on up there. This is the entry lobby where there will be exhibitions, but also it's kind of orientation space. We've removed a lot of floor plates and a lot of columns and things that we can remove. These are historical columns and beams in the main body. But we've torn out floors, left some bridges, we have stairways connecting levels. So there are 3 or 4 different levels being connected here. This brooding object you can see from the street, which is actually really quite simply a small-scale black box theater for the museum. And there are the galleries. They're quite simple. We're just revitalizing the basement, sinking parts of the floor, and you can see in the back there's a hint. Anywhere you are in the museum, the idea is that there's a hint, there's something else along the path of the museum that ties it all together. So what you're seeing there is this, which we call the void. The void, it connects 4 different levels together, and it gives you the sense that you're not entirely sure how many levels there are or what the distance is, but it gives you a glimpse of people moving in the background. But it's also a kind of an object. So it's an object that's a whole, which I like very much. And if you look at it from the back side, it actually becomes an object. So what was a hole becomes a hanging mass, and where you can see people on a completely different level as well. So there's a bit of a trick there from the different sides as you move around it to see people on different levels. So this is a vertical connector piece on the interior. There's another piece in the garage, which what we're calling the infinity chamber, which basically brings people through an active garage and becomes part of the museum, and brings people in through the basement in a different way. So it's just a ceiling piece. This is the backside showing the Spring Street Park, and then the 2 buildings on the roof. We have flooded the roof with water as well for cooling, because it's very hot up there in the summer, so it's an evaporative cooling pool with this new ground floating on top with these other objects on top of that. The cafe is also, it has a kind of a figures pushing out, but also figures pushing in that end up being what I feel like very much like a black hole kind of moment, where we've used tattoos in this case to highlight the shadows of the object itself. They're fake shadows, they're not actual shadows from the sun, but they're kind of, if you notice, they're accumulating where there's already darkness in the object. And that came out of us talking a lot actually with the manufacturer of the material, the FRP, and deciding that it's LA, it's hot, we have to have a lighter color on the outside. We wanted to originally do black, and then it turned out that we would just do this shadow concept, which I think is a better resolved idea anyway. So this is the cafe bar. This is the interior of that, with several large jacks floating in space. There's a boardroom on a 2nd level, looking out at the promenade to give a sense of the whole space, and this mysterious thing on the right. How it's built with steel. We're going to do all composite chunks, but we're introducing a slight steel frame in order to interface with the city of LA in terms of seismic requirements. But it's a razor-thin kind of construction still, with FRP on either side of a partial steel frame, as opposed to a rain screen, which you might normally associate with a project like this. And again, very important for us to fly in the chunks. In fact, imperative on this project that they be lightweight, that the building be built quickly in chunks, and then be flown in with sky cranes, because there's a limited amount of load we can introduce into the existing building, so this thing will kind of float on the existing roof. So there it is at dusk. Thank you very much. So if anybody has questions, I'm happy to do that.
So a lot of the words that you describe the process with the pushing and the switching, very active verb, does that actually relate to the making process that you're doing? Are you doing these things, or do you just look at like all of the images, where you hold up the forms, do you push things, do things, and see what happens, or is it very much calculated and sort of?
I appreciate that question. I'm not interested in the real physics of what happens when you take, let's say, a jack and push it through a physical material, particularly not at scale, although that's an interesting idea. I like to imagine what would be involved in doing that, like if you did it at the architectural scale. I'm more interested in the kind of fake physics where we are authors of how and exactly, precisely how something might interface with something else. So I'm not making the argument that this is literally how it would work if you had a particular kind of material in a particular object. This is definitely authored, but it's not totally unphysical. As you notice, the way that things stretch or don't stretch or whatever, there's some hints towards physics for sure and materiality, but it's fake. So it's done in the computer. It's also not done with software, to give you the technical answer. Also not done with software that does that. That's done in a different way. We looked at that at one point. We looked at software that does things like shrink wrapping objects, things like that. This was 4 summers ago. We evaluated all of them. Every time we used it, it looked like we thought it was going to work. And that was so boring. So we threw that out the window and figured out our way to do it.
You spoke about context, parts of the whole, and how they relate to everything around you. As an observer of this building right now, on the outside, to me it looks like it's wrong on site. But there's a lot that goes in it. There's integration, there's systems, there's, you showed us how you were able to provide 3 buildings underground and all that. There's a lot of thinking. What do you consider your architecture? Do you consider it contextual, or do you consider it as a
Well, I mean, it's a totally fair question, and I think this is a longer discussion, and it's one that's been had in architecture over the ages. Whether it's more relevant, I think you can also only talk about things in your own time. Like we can talk about what's relevant now. We can talk about my own personal predilections too, but I would hope that those are also embedded in their kind of relevancy. Not just a private project, entirely private, meaning it's something in discourse that's going on. And I think that you could say that like in modernism, the project of autonomy, let's say, of a kind of let's say, of Mies, would be completely different than a project of autonomy by, let's say, Peter Eisenman. That would be completely different than a current project of autonomy. And I think that we have to really split hairs there because they're quite different. I'm not interested in a project of total autonomy, but if I had to choose, which I don't, but if I had to, I would always argue against saying that the building is in any form a resultant of context. I just don't believe that. I think we hear that quite often. You always hear it in the media about architecture. I think that the minute you do architecture, or you make an architectural act, you change the context. So in a way, it's a strange argument. You can't be both erupting from context and changing it at the same time. So yeah, the buildings do go out of their way to have joints in many instances, like literal joints and gaps and even moats around them, for sure. I mean, this one really looks, it does look a little bit plopped down, as you say, but it's done in a way where, like, notice there's a joint. It's a little difficult to tell actually how this thing actually engages, but there is a joint here. There's also a secondary joint here as well. There's several joints to keep the thing from merging with this ground. And you notice even within the ground itself, it has its own joints. So the ground itself can be broken up into 5 supercomponents that can be lifted by airframes. So it's very much a set of parts that go together. It may look unified, but the intention is in fact to talk about a new kind of discreteness that goes against all of the continuity that we're familiar with. So I don't know if that answered your question. It's a very difficult one. It's one that I have to say, especially when I was doing the Kinmen project, I was vexed by this subject of global culture, we're finding more and more in international competitions that is the #1 way that the projects are evaluated. Even in terms of percentages, I think 40% of the evaluation of the project is going to be based on your local culture, asking your strategy on local culture. So I lost a lot of sleep on how to do that in a way where use a bit of sleight of hand, where I'm doing what I need to do, but I'm also doing what they want. And so we played that game a little bit, and I think ultimately it doesn't have to hurt the architecture. I think it can improve it. Yeah.
This may come across as a gotcha question, but it's not at all, because I love what you're doing, and I really love the idea of airlifting huge parts to the building site, and composites are so like the transporting parts inside building becomes a problem. The one example that I know of anecdotally in Northern California where there was the possibility of airlifting a monolithic structure, it was a residential project, to the site. It wasn't possible because of all of the homeowners in the path of the flight route had to give approval, and some wouldn't. I'm just wondering.
I know this story. Are you working with Bill Chrysler?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know the story from Bill.
I'm wondering, I want this to be possible, but is it, what would have to change?
I have two answers to this question. First of all, yes, I have heard this anecdote. It may be true. I don't know. It's probably true. I've heard that anecdote. I know it's probably true. I don't know. I do know that it's not true in the case of urban areas. It's only residential areas. So if you can somehow get around them, it's fine. That's my technical answer. And I know that this is true because 1 block away from this, I was telling my students this, I think, today. No, I don't know who I was telling this. Maybe David last night. That 1 block away from this, they flew in giant Transformer robots for the first Transformers movie. 1 block away from this in LA, and I watched the filming of it there. So I know it's possible. That's my technical answer. The more important answer that I want to give is that I don't want to come across as in terms of I guess in terms that the material and an advancement in any technology, whether it's material or fabrication or project delivery, that any of those things are absolutely required for me to do my architectural project. I find it really fun to surf on those ideas, and I really do want to build in composites, but I think it would be a dead end if I put all of my eggs in that basket and I said I will only build in composites. It happened to work out really well that we have to on this project because of loading, but there's one project I look at actually as an example of how to do, for instance, tattoos and build in strange scale effects without doing it literally in composites, and that is Rem Koolhaas's CCTV building, which I find quite interesting. If you look at the way he deals with seams and joints and relative sizes of things, and he pumps some up and he reduces some into the background, he creates a really interesting figuration of a building, which is a mega figuration. And many other architects have done it in different ways as well. And that's ultimately what I would be interested in, is playing with the scale effects, playing with mega figuration. It doesn't have to be in composite material. I love this building for the marble. I'd love to figure this out in marble too. So what I'm saying is that it can't possibly be a gotcha question. I'm just stepping out of the way because although you're right, like I wouldn't stake my work on that particular material and those particular contingencies.
It's like what you said, is just because I would like to see it happen. So
yeah. No, I'm fine with that. Anyone else? I'll take one more. Not a repeat. Someone else.
Question.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm curious about how you develop the tattoos on the buildings. Like you're very interested in the formal rigor of the actual thing, the physical thing, and it seems I wonder how you think about geometry within the tattoos. So how do you go about it?
No, that's great. That's a very good question. I would like to think of them as being. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. He's asking about what constitutes the tattoos, and I think what you're asking is what are they? What are we talking about here? Yeah. They are intended to be an embed of a different material. So it's not just a graphic. These are not painted on there. They are embedded in there. So the plan, for instance, on this project is that we lay down 1/4-inch aluminum, which is going to be black anodized, onto the mold. We bend it down into the mold, and we mold the FRP on top of that. So it'll be actually, it's funny. What I like about that is you're not using a metal structure and infilling with fiberglass panels. The fiberglass is the structure, and the metal is inlaid as a detail. So I'm really interested in them becoming physical, is what I'm saying. That they're not just kind of literally like a decorative thing. Which is, I think, that's why I call them tattoos, because it's not a super graphic. A super graphic is different than a tattoo. Like you could paint on my body with spray paint, and that would be a super graphic. But a tattoo is in the skin. It's embedded in there, and that's why although I know this is not a disciplinary word, it's quite accurate for what I mean. So that's why I use words like that. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.